As we're all probably aware, come next Wednesday night, we sit at the Pesach Seder and we tell our story to our children, to our whoever's around our table that we can share with. And we fulfill thereby one of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, which is known as the Haggadah, which is based on a sentence in the Torah which says, "V'higada Tolavincha," that's the name you shall explain or teach to your or tell to your children on that day. It is because of what Hashem did for me that I went free from Egypt. It is because of this, actually. Okay, so we're going to prepare ourselves for that, for fulfilling these mitzvot, and we're going to do so with a discussion of the Haggadah. So I would recommend if you have a Haggadah handy and you can get to it, please do. I'll try to make it as clear as I can. But next Wednesday night, in total, we're going to sit down and we're going to address 5 mitzvot, 5 commandments. 2 of them are from the Torah itself, and 3 of them are rabbinic in nature, and they are rabbinic mitzvot which are connected to Torah obligations. So let's see what they are. The first is to eat matzah, which is one of the salient features of the holiday of Pesach. And by eating matzah that night, after sunset, after the stars are out, and before the sun rises, we fulfill a biblical mitzvah to tell the story of Egypt, of the Exodus from Egypt, and we'll see what that means and implies. We fulfill a second distinct biblical mitzvah. And the 3 rabbinic ordinances are A, to drink 4 cups of wine, B, to eat moror, and C, to recite Hallel, psalms of praise. Now, you might ask that eating the bitter herbs itself is a Torah mitzvah because it's mentioned in the Torah that we do that. But by tradition, we only eat the bitter herbs together with the Paschal offering. And therefore, nowadays, when we don't have the Paschal offering, it drops down to a rabbinic ordinance instead of a Torah mitzvah. The 4 cups of wine we're going to see are related to the other obligations that are there. And indeed, it's surprising to learn, but according to almost all opinions, in order to properly tell the story of going out of Egypt, one should be holding a wine glass in their hand, which I'm not doing right now, as they tell the story. And that's related to the nature of drinking wine, which is celebratory. So therefore, we see from this connection that it's not just telling the story, but it's celebrating the story of the Exodus from Egypt that properly fulfills the mitzvah. And I want to stop for a moment and ask you, if you think about it, your children, your grandchildren for sure, do they really understand your life, your perspective on your own life? Just recently, a woman passed away in the community, late 80s. She had grown up in Hungary, spent time in Israel, come to the United States. And she was very insistent before she passed away that her children and her grandchildren understand a detailed view of her life and what her life meant to her. And I thought it was very refreshing to see this because obviously it deepens family connections and it enables children not only to think of their grandmother from their own perhaps childish perspective, but to begin to, especially as they grow older, have something that they can fall back on and see their grandparents' life from an adult perspective, from a developed perspective, from a historical perspective, from a perspective which probably would take on added meaning in terms of how they live their own lives and how they deal with their own challenges in life. And I want to suggest right off the bat that the fact that the mitzvah of telling the story involves us holding a glass of wine and celebrating. And the fact that the mitzvah is meant not just to convey simple historical facts, which obviously could be written down or synopsized, but rather this is an opportunity to convey something more full, more developed, and something which over time could grow and increase in meaning for our children, for our grandchildren, and even for ourselves. And that's the theme that I keep coming back to, telling our story. And there are two sentences in the Torah that say this very explicitly. There really are four, but we're going to look at two if you want to look them up. If you go to Exodus chapter 10, sentence 2, the Torah says, "Uleman tesaper ba'oznei vincha uvein bincha es asher sanalti b'Mitzrayim," that you may recount in the hearing of your child and of your child's child how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, I displayed my signs, in order that you may know that I am God. Big statement. But that's not the sentence we rest upon when we have the mitzvah of telling the Haggadah on Pesach night. But rather we move on to Exodus sentence 13, chapter 13, sentence 8, where the Torah uses the word magid, v'hi gadeta levincha bayamahu lemor, ba'avor zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. And you shall explain to your children on that day. It is because of this that Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. So let's look at the contrast between the two. There's a whole different context between these two sentences. I recommend you look them up. But it relates to this idea of telling the story with a cup of wine in your hand. You have to be celebratory. It's not a question of relaying facts. It's also a question of making it personal. The first sentence that we quoted, Exodus 10:12, is really from God's perspective, how God made a mockery of the Egyptians through the plagues, and how God displayed signs and wonders among them, and had the purpose that we would know that God is God. Okay, that's a big deal and an important basis and pillar for fulfilling the Torah and for fulfilling the mission of the Jewish people. But it's so different than the second sentence we quoted in Exodus 13:8. Explain to your child, and we'll see what the word higadata has several ramifications. And we say ba'avor zeh, because of this, and we're going to have to define what that this is. But because of this, Hashem did for me when I went out of Egypt. And of course, based on this, Maimonides writes that it's not a question of telling a story the night of Pesach, but it's a question of conveying a personal sense of redemption, a sense that I myself benefited, experienced, and celebrate personally the Exodus from Egypt, not remembering something. And we're going to see how the Haggadah deals with this. But if you look at the Haggadah, if you think, and I just want to emphasize one more proof to this. If you look at the sequence of telling the story in the Haggadah, we seem to tell it backwards in the early stages of the Haggadah, because we first start off saying, Avodim Hayinu, we were enslaved in Paro and we went out. And then we go on and talk about the fact that our ancestors, our earlier ancestors, were idolaters. And they went down to Egypt, and we quote the chapter 24 from the book of Yoshua, the book of Joshua, that describes that. And the obvious question is, why not do it in order? First, we were idolaters. We went down to Egypt. And then say, Avodim Hayinu, we were enslaved in Egypt. And then we went out with a mighty hand and an outstretched hand. So there's something about the telling that, just like when a person tells a first-person story, and it tumbles out of you with excitement and with appreciation and with gratitude, you might start in the middle of the story and say, wow, an amazing thing happened to us. You know, we were enslaved. It was hopeless. And all of a sudden, Moshe, Aaron, they appeared on the scene. They had signs, they had wonders. Oh, and, before that, they were the burning bush. And before that, we were our forefathers, how do we get into Egypt to begin with? I'll tell you that story also. When a person's engaged in a story, it's not told so clinically, but it's told experientially. And if you walk away from one thing with this class, please, please, as you sit at the Seder table, even hopefully not, if you even by yourself, tell the story experientially with excitement and think about how much it applies to your own life, who you are, what you're made of, how you deal with challenges yet today, how it shaped not only your great, 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 great grandparents, but how these events shape attitudes which define who we are and how we live our lives today. So this is the source. We're going to hang our hats on the idea that the mitzvah from the Torah of saying the Haggadah is solidly based specifically on Exodus 13:8, where you explain to your child, V'yigada Torah vincha, where you're passing something on in a manner that connects and reaches into the heart of the child. And then you have a hook to it because of this, and we're going to define what this is. And if you break down the sentence, there's 6 components, and they actually follow through in the Haggadah very nicely. We're not going to go through all 6 of them. We're going to stay with the first one, really. But the first says, relate to your child on that day. Why specifically next Wednesday evening after the stars come out on the 15th day of Nisan? Because it's not just that's the moment it happened, but that's the moment that this energy stirs in the world and we can re-experience it so much. Saying we have to use words is because of this. We're going to define very dramatically at the end of this class. Hashem acted for me, it personalized when I came forth out of Egypt, that, as the Haggadah is going to say, we would still be slaves of Paro. I would still be a slave to Paro if I did not come out of Egypt. And the only way I could have come out of Egypt unencumbered by Pharaoh and by the Egyptian bondage is because I experienced the story exactly as it was related to me by the generation before me, as it was relayed to them as the generation before them, and so on. That's why we are who we are, why we can be who we can be, and that's how we deal with our own lives today. Now, let's start early on in the Seder. Almost right away, when we sit down to the Seder, we seem to spill the whole beans. We ask the 4 questions. We try to get the kids involved. We point out the matzah. This is what we ate when we were enslaved. Anybody who wants to come in and can join us. We look forward to being more free in the future. We're setting the stage for this being a transformative experience. Hopefully this evokes the kids to ask some questions. How is this night different? Chametz and matzah. We're only eating matzah tonight. We have bitter herbs. We dip. We eat leaning. What's going on here? And then according to some people, we answer, Avadim, Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were enslaved in Egypt and God took us out there with a strong hand. And we're done. We're going to push that idea aside. And we're going to say we are not answering the 4 questions when we say we were enslaved in Egypt. But rather, we're going to do something else that's more important. These first paragraphs, many paragraphs to come, are going to be tuning us in to fulfilling the idea that we should relate to our children on this day. And we're going to explain how that works. When we say we were enslaved of Egypt and we were taken out by God, what we're here to explain is we're not beginning the story. But what we're doing is we're saying we have a fundamental reason for gathering tonight. We have an obligation, we have a mitzvah to fulfill. Why do we have a mitzvah to fulfill? Very simply, because a living creature responds to stimuli. so that if an amazing good was done for us on our behalf and we experienced it, we don't just remember it and store it on our hard drive or write it down and put it on a bookshelf, but we feel it. It excites us, and we express that excitement in words. You know, if you imagine, there was a big basketball game on Sunday for San Diego State and they won. Imagine somebody says, I bought a courtside ticket. I traveled to, where was the game? Louisville, Kentucky. And I saw the game and the Aztecs won by 1 point at the end, and I'm really glad I went. You'd say, Nebuch, person wasted his money. You want a guy to say, I want to tell you the story. You can't imagine what I did last weekend. First of all, I'll tell you about my flight getting there. I'll tell you about what I wore, how I got the tickets. There has to be a sense of saying, I went to the game. I saw what happened. I invested time, energy. We, the Jewish people, historically, we invested 210 years of our lives in Egypt. We have a lot to talk about. We had many experiences. And if we're not simply remembering in the cold, distant sense of the word, but rather we're remembering and recounting and sharing, which is what in the words that he got it to means. We want you to share in our joy and in our fulfillment. So we want you to hear the whole story, including how my luggage got lost and it only came to the hotel 20 minutes before I had to leave to go to the game. But thankfully, I could wear my San Diego State sweatshirt at the game like I always wanted to. These details are not just details. They're not just little facts, but they're things that all contribute to the depth of gratitude, excitement, appreciation. The fact that I want to share this experience. I want you to enjoy it with me. I want you to be there with me, because that's how important it is to me right now that this team won by 1 point. But that's how important it is for us today, thousands of years after the Exodus from Egypt, more than 3,300 years later. That's how important it is for us today. That's how excited we are. That's how filled with gratitude. And therefore, these sentences, the beginning of this Magid section, we're not telling a story. We were slaves in Egypt, God took us out with a strong hand. But the emphasis is, and if he didn't take us out, as it says in the Haggadah, you and your children and your children's children, we would yet be slaves. Well, what do you mean? I mean, there aren't too many. That sounds unlikely. There's no Pharaoh even left in the world to enslave us. We wouldn't be who we are today, and that's why we want to tell you this story. And then we go on and we say, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua, these great rabbis, they also told the story. They knew the story already. They told it all night long. They were excited. They debated it. They questioned it. When, nighttime, daytime, start here, start there. Those things were all important to them. Why was it important to them? Because they had so much to contribute and to explain and to share, and they were still so excited, and it was so meaningful for them. And that's what the whole introduction is. It's not why even, it's how we're to tell the story. And that's where we come to the 4 sons. Because note something very important about the sons. Most Haggadahs ask this question. I haven't seen too many great answers to it. We speak about 4 sons. So first of all, we have a wise son and we have an evil son. Not a match. We should have a righteous son and a not righteous son. We don't have a righteous son at the table. We have one who's wise, who asks detailed questions. We have an evil one who separates himself. We have a simple one who just says, just tell me the bottom line. And we have one who doesn't even engage with us and sees crazy things going on, like the matzah and the moror and the leaning and the dipping, and doesn't even bother to open his mouth. He's sort of like, all right, just when's the meat coming? When's the brisket going to be served? So what is the idea of the 4 sons? Again, how do we tell the story? We have to tune into who the child is. We have to differentiate. We have to have a way of relating this story to each and every child around us, including the child that still resides within us, who has, we have our own ways of resisting the full message and the full understanding of the story. So we're still on how. And I just want to emphasize that when you look, and that's where in each case we're responding. The Chacham is also a little detached, asking intellectual questions, and we have to give him detailed answers. The evil one who's disassociated, we need to try to associate him. We need to smack him with something that wakes him up and makes him feel as though, hey, this really, listen, because this matters to you. It's relevant to the way you're going to live the rest of your life. The simple one, you got to give him simple stories, but you have to do it in a way that he can relate to it. And finally, the one who doesn't even bother answering. What do we answer him? We quote from our very verse 13:8. And we say, because of this. And when we say because of this, we point to the things on the table. And this is when we're concluding this whole section as to the how we tell the story. What does it mean because of this? I want to suggest an explanation that Rashi has on the Chumash itself, which is very eye-opening. Because after all, what does the sentence in the Torah say in 13:8? It says, because of this, God did these things for me when he took me out of Egypt. What's the this? The this is that we're sitting at a Seder table today, 3,300 years later. And this is why God did all that he did then in order to yet inspire us in 2023, to yet inspire us 3,300 years later, to yet shape who we are and how we see the world. And that's what we're really telling each of the children from their own perspective. You want details, I'll give you details. You want to make mocking statements, I'll knock you in the teeth so that I can get your attention and say there's a lot of suffering in the world. And I'm going to teach you how better to understand it and how better to triumph over it and how better to live your life no matter what circumstances you live under. The best, the worst, or somewhere in the middle. The one who needs simplicity, we give him simplicity, but it's poignant. And the one who doesn't open up his mouth, we say, look, I'm telling you this story over a cup of wine because I want to drink from this cup, because this is the cup I drink from every day of my life. This is what shapes me. This is who I am, why I am the way I am. And I'm going to tell you this story in a way that can reshape who you are. And that's why we say it this day. And now we're ready to tell the story. Now we're first ready, because we haven't spilled the beans. We haven't given away the end of the story. What we've done is we've galvanized the attention of ourselves and everyone who's around us with the simple idea, we cannot be who we are capable of being. And we are not today who we are, other than the fact that we experience this, we relive it, we remember it, we're excited to discuss it, we want to share it with the next generation, we want to relive it ourselves, no matter how wise, no matter how learned. It's exciting, okay? I was there in Boston when Ted Williams got the hit that put his batting average over 400. Let me tell you what that was like. He was a very trite example, but to use a poignant example, we're saying, I was there 3,300 years ago. I was there when the Jewish people began. And how was I there? I'm not Methuselah, but because this is my family's story. This is who I am. This is what makes me who I am. And I don't need a DNA chart to understand it. I need the Torah's wisdom to open my eyes. And now we're ready to begin at the beginning. And when we begin at the beginning tonight, you're going to see it's a very surprising beginning. And the beginning really is the paragraph in the Haggadah that says, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu, which reads, in the beginning, our fathers were worshipers of idols. That's the beginning. That's where we're going to start the story. And how we start the story, we discussed this last year. I'm just going to go over it very briefly. But we discuss it by quoting from the book of Joshua, and we quote in a very unusual way. And it says in the Haggadah, and Joshua spoke to the whole people. Okay, so it was already a full generation after the Exodus. Thus has Hashem, the God of Israel, spoken. Your fathers dwelt in olden times beyond the river Euphrates. Terach was the father of our father Abraham. He was also the father of Nachor. They served other gods. There was the world. The world was a world of void. The world lacked purpose. The world lacked meaning. The world was just adrift. And then the narrative goes on, and I, God, took your father Abraham from behind the river, and I led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and I multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac, and I gave to Isaac Jacob and Esau. I gave to Esau Mount Seir. He's part of history. And Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt, period. This is the beginning of the story. This is an unusual, unique telling of the story from the perspective of Joshua. Joshua already is from the vantage point of looking backwards, talking to the children of the people who went out of Egypt, talking at the end of the conquest of the land, talking when they're ready to settle into the land, a new chapter of Jewish life. And Joshua does something very unusual here. He doesn't say, wow, look how great our forefather Avram was, that he separated himself from worshiping idols, and he found God and brought monotheism to the world and changed an awareness, brought God down to the world and shared God's an understanding of God and God's perspective in the world. That's not what he says. He says instead, look what God did. God took our father Abraham, and God led him throughout the land, and God multiplied a seed, which means that neither Abraham nor Sarah were capable of having children, and yet they had the one child, Isaac. And then again with Isaac and Rebekah, they had a child, two children, Jacob and Esau, incompatible. One selected and stepped forward to become the bearer of the legacy of the Jewish people, and the other didn't. So what did God do? This is the amazing beginning of the story. God took the one who would answer the call and who would carry forward the legacy of the Jewish people through history, and he sent him down to Egypt with his family, while Esau and his children rode off into the sunset, powerful, rich. And here, my friends, is a definition of what we are as the chosen people, which is shocking, spins our heads, but is absolutely essential to understanding the story of us going out of Egypt. It's essential for the following reason. Because when we talk about the beginning of the story, we're talking about the beginning of existence. We're talking about creation. We're talking about the 2,000 years of void and emptiness that the world experienced until Abraham. And as it says in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, that there were 20 generations, 10 until Noah, 10 more until Abraham. And Abraham gathered up all the reward. And the reward here isn't money in the bank. The reward is fulfilling the purpose of the world, which is yet the reward that the Jewish people have today. That's the Ba'avur Zeh. What is the this that God took us out of Egypt? It's that God elevated us, and God selected us, and God gave us meaningful lives to pursue. And God assures us, and that's paragraph after paragraph here. That's the idea that God fulfills his assurance to Israel. Baruch Shomer Avtachato Yisrael. God doesn't make promises. If God says, I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. If God tells Abraham, your children are going to be enslaved in Egypt and they're going to go out with a lot of money, we leave with a lot of money. We don't need a written guarantee. We don't need a document. We don't need to have an adjudicator to go to God and say, hey, you forgot a few details here, pay us back. It all happens. But the amazing thing here is it happens under God's providence, because that's what life is essentially all about. Why are you here? Why am I here? Because God brought us into existence. And God brought us into existence gratis. He didn't owe us anything. And he elevated us as Jewish people to a pedestal and says, Balvor Zeh, I took your ancestors out of Egypt 3,300 years ago. You know why? Because you're going to sit down and eat matzah together and remember the Exodus. Because you're going to celebrate the freedom from Egypt so that you could worship God and fulfill the Torah. It's an ongoing story. You're the reason for this story. And to the extent that I'm the reason for the story, I really want to tell it. I really want to share it. And I really want to make sure that each and every one of my children understand my story so that they can ultimately make the story their own. So the wise child, I need to give him the detail and the coloring and the resonance that he needs and she needs in order to swallow that story hard and say, wow, I am proud of this legacy. And I realize that this is why God has given me life, so that when I get older, I'm going to be the one scrubbing and cleaning and searching for chametz and washing out the house and making sure that we have a pristine Seder and that we eat matzah and that we drink wine and that we feel exalted and we feel excited and we feel grateful for the lives that we're given the opportunity to live. Balvor Zeh, because of this, because of the next chapters we're going to write. And that's why these are not old chapters in a book. These are the reasons why we're celebrating tonight and the reasons that we're excited to have Pesach again next year. This year we're slaves, we say in the beginning. Next year we'll be free. We'll celebrate again. We'll be yet more free. We'll be yet more grateful. We'll be yet more exalted. We'll have more reason to stand on the Seder night and tell our descendants and everyone who will listen to us, look at the legacy we carry forward. Look at the lives we're living. Look at the matzah we're eating. Look at the story, our story that we're telling. Look at the Hallel we're going to sing in praise and thanksgiving. Look at the bitter herbs we're going to eat so that we can taste every aspect that went into us arriving at this point. Look at it all. This is our story. This is who we are. This makes us who we are today. And the greater extent we celebrate it because of this, we will be greater next year. So here we have a Pesach Seder. In brief, we spend time in the beginning. We make kiddush, we pick up a glass of wine and we sanctify the day. And we say, yes, we're going to say this coming a week from tomorrow night. Yes, this is the 15th of Nisan. This is the moment. This is when the world is poised for yet another chapter of redemption. And we're going to make it happen. And so we recite the kiddush. And then we introduce it by getting the kids involved. And as the kids get involved, we decide this is how we're going to tell our story, because it's our story. We are not who we are sitting here tonight, other than the fact that we're the product of all these events in Egypt, and we've continuously celebrated them, and we've continuously held up these glasses of wine and tasted that wine as we celebrated and told the story holding a glass of wine that we're going to make a blessing over and drink from at the end of this section of Magid of telling the story, because we want to taste it. We want to experience it. We want our kids to experience it. We want this to be the ongoing freedom that's taking place. And of course, why? Because it has a purpose. It has an endpoint. Just like the slavery in Egypt had an endpoint of going free on the 15th of Nisan, and arriving at Mount Sinai and having God speak to us and elevate us and give us a Torah. So there's an end point to come also. And that's why details, I mean, it picks up every color and nuance. We're going to say in a couple more pages into the story, we're going to say how the Jewish people suffered and they called out to Hashem. When people suffer, oftentimes they become despairing. Oftentimes they become broken. Oftentimes they give up on life, but not the slaves in Egypt. The work was backbreaking. It lasted for generations. It wasn't 4 years or 5 years or 8 years or one generation or two. It was probably 3 full generations of people. But yet they continuously called out to Hashem because they realized this is just part of our story. There's an end point coming, and therefore we call out to God and say, God, you elevated Abraham. You brought him across the Euphrates. You promised him the land of Canaan. We know you stand by that promise, and we stand by as your people, ready for your redemption. And hence, we're always going to pray for you. Hence, when we're standing by the sea and the Egyptian army is bearing down upon us, and we're in a totally hopeless situation, what do? We call out to God, and we just, because we remember, God, there's a plan here. There's an end goal here. God elevated us as a people. Yes, Abraham self-selected into it through his righteousness, through his kindness, through his devotion to other people, through his commitment to tzedakah and mishpat, to acting justly and to doing tzedakah, righteousness, kindness, goodness to all other people. So God grabbed him and said, okay, you're my man. Your children are my people. We're going to carry this through history. And yeah, you're going to go down to Egypt. That's why Joshua ends the story. You're going to go down to Egypt because we're not going to go down to Egypt once. In every generation, we're going to experience bitterness. In every generation, we're going to experience challenge, more or less on different levels. Why is Lavan the greatest threat to the Jewish people in all history? Because Lavan said, there's nothing special about the Jewish people. These are my grandchildren. I'm an idol worshiper, just like Terach, your grandfather was. And he tells Jacob, you think you're running off with these 12 kids? They're yours? They're mine. I'm their grandfather. They belong to me. They belong to this world. They're nothing special. That's the greatest threat to the Jewish people. And the answer is, God took me miraculously out of Egypt. And that's what I want to share with you. And God did it for a reason so that we could continue to write chapter after chapter, generation after generation, until we reach that end point. And when that end point seems furthest away and most distant, we're still sure it's going to happen. We still cry out to Hashem. We say, God, what's going on? We're stuck here by the edge of the Yam Suf, of the sea. The Egyptians, we have no hope. Do something, because you got to do something. God says, okay, walk into the water. Show me your trust and I'll split it. Jewish people stood at the barbed wire at the end of World War II and they said, what's this all about? Where do we go from here? There's no place for us in the world. And we know that in the last 80 years, how much has transpired and how much confirmation we, the Jewish people, have received that there's a plan for us and there's a goal for us and we're fulfilling it and we're writing the next chapter today, and our children will write the next chapter after us and their children will write the next chapter after them, and we know the end of the story. We're heading for the end of the story. And that's why that's why I'm excited, happy, thrilled, enthusiastic to sit down next Wednesday night to gather those people I love around me. And I'm going to start off by telling them, it's a story you got to listen to because it's who you are. It's who I am. It's why we are the way we are. Let's get into this story. And then as we tell the story, we're going to say, look what a deal we have. Look how God has placed so much trust in us. So of course, we're going to trust God. Of course, we're sure that this is where the story is going. If you take this narrative and you follow it through the Haggadah, I promise you that even after a long, drawn-out Seder, and even if the brisket doesn't come out exactly as well as your wife wanted it to, you'll be able to pick up that fourth cup of wine and really sing Hallel, really express gratitude, praise, and thankfulness to God, and then ready to carry through and ready to continue writing the history of the Jewish people. That's what the story we're telling. It's an ongoing story. We have a big part to tell. Our children will have a bigger part to tell. Their children will have a still bigger part to tell. And it goes on until the end of time when everything becomes crystal clear to everyone. I want to wish everybody a joyous, happy, wonderful, and uplifting Pesach Seder. Thank you very much. Any questions?
That was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Have a happy Pesach.
Safe travels.